This right here is a real grain to glass Irish whiskey. This week, let me tell you about the single pot still whiskey from Ballykeefe distillery. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this is the single pot still whiskey from Ballykeefe distillery. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, there are a lot of new Irish whiskey producers on the market who've been kind of making whiskey for a while, either making it themselves or sourcing it, and some of them are getting kind of big, but Ballykeefe are really small. Like, they are a little artisan producer because they are a real kind of grain to glass, farm to distillery kind of operation. So traditionally on some farms in Ireland, they would have actually had a distillery down in the corner, down the back of the farm, where they would have taken some of the barley, some of the grains grown on the farm, and then used it in the distillery to make their own whiskey on site. And that's kind of what Ballykeefe are trying to recreate. So they are in the same area as the oldest written records of Irish whiskey in the world. So the Red Book of Ossory from 1324 is just down the road from Ballykeefe distillery, but they're not in operation since 1324. They're only opened since 2017, so they're only open for a little while, but they've been making some kind of very nice stuff, and they're trying to recreate that old kind of style of a farm that also has a distillery on site. This bottle was actually given to me by a colleague who's finishing up in work, and as a little kind of going away present, he got me this very nice bottle of whiskey because he just lives down the road from the distillery, and he just said he wanted to get my thoughts on his local distillery. And that's a sentence I love hearing, because local distilling was a thing that was very popular in Ireland, and up to recently it hasn't, because the market has been dominated by a few big players, very powerful, influential players. So I'm very happy to see local distilling making a comeback, especially a family run operation like this one. The Ging family, who actually make Ballykeefe whiskey, own the farm that it comes from. So they are a traditional farming family. They're not a traditional distilling family, but they have opened themselves up a very nice distillery on their family farm. So they take barley that they grew themselves and they use it in making their own whiskey. They have a very kind of sustainable ethos, so they have zero off-farm waste. So all the spent grains that are used in making the whiskey get used for animal feed, so the animals get fed with the kind of leftover grains, which is, I think, a very good practice. They also source the water from their own kind of area, so it's all very sustainable. Very little waste goes into making this whiskey, which is a single pot still Irish whiskey. So single pot still, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the kind of native style of whiskey that's native to Ireland. You have to use at least 30% malted barley, at least 30% unmalted barley, and at most 5% other grains. So distilleries can kind of play around with the recipe. Some go straight down the middle, 50-50, some go 70-30 or 30-70. What they have done here at Ballykeefe distillery is they've gone 60% malted barley and 40% unmalted barley. So that should give us plenty of caramel, plenty of good kind of rich kind of fruity flavors that come through from that malted barley, but also some good biscuity notes, while still not being too kind of light. You should get a bit of spiciness, a bit of oiliness, a bit of texture from that unmalted barley inclusion. It was aged in a first fill bourbon cask, so it should again have plenty of sweetness, plenty of vanilla, plenty of caramel kind of flavor coming through from that bourbon cask, and it comes in at 46% ABV, which is a nice weight for a whiskey. It has plenty of opportunity to get a good flavor, a good bit of weight, without being kind of overpowering or too strong. It is a single barrel style of whiskey, so this is from cask number 20 and it's bottle number 58. So each bottle does have its own individual bottle and cask number on it. So if you find one you like, you'll be able to go back and get another bottle from that cask. But let's go in now for the nose on the Ballykeefe single pot still. Cheers. Okay, very, very sweet up front, very caramelized, biscuity malt. Again, kind of like a butterscotch toffee, kind of a bit grainy though. It's still with that kind of biscuity note coming through. It kind of reminds me of like a sticky toffee pudding, you know, where you get that kind of nice grainy kind of sponge, where you get the sweetness coming through from the cake, but you also get that really rich kind of toffee sauce on top, really kind of rich, densely sweet. It's not super heavy on the vanilla, like I kind of might have been expecting a little bit more vanilla coming through, but it's really heavy into like the caramel kind of sweetness you get There's also a bit of kind of creaminess, kind of coating it, kind of creamy texture coming through on the nose, kind of like that kind of caramel, butterscotch, kind of toffee flavor you can get. There's also a little bit of like orange citrus, like the zest you get on the outside of an orange, that kind of flavor is coming through on the nose. And a little bit of spice, kind of like almost like a gingery spice, where it's not like really heavy spice, but it's kind of that lighter, kind of fresher spiciness coming through. And yeah, I think that's kind of all I'm getting on the nose, so I think it's time we go in for the palate. Cheers. It's rich, it's thick, it's still got that really kind of malty characteristic that I got on the nose. It's still got a lot of that caramelized, biscuity note coming through. It's still nice and sweet, plenty of spice that does come through there as well. And there's not actually that much heat. Now it does come in at 46% ABV, so it's not a cask strength whiskey, but it's not a huge amount of heat that comes through. Like, I can tell, it is a 4-year-old Irish whiskey. I can tell there's a little bit of kind of youthfulness in there, but it doesn't have that kind of metallic or sharp note that you do sometimes get with very young whiskies. It does have a little bit of kind of youthfulness to it, but it's still a very nice whiskey. A lot of sweetness in there. That spiciness though, it kind of, on the nose, it was much lighter. It was much kind of like that kind of, like I said, gingery kind of spice. The spiciness on the palate, much more earthy and kind of like almost like cloves. So I'm going to go in again for another sip and see what that tastes like. Yeah, on the palate, that spiciness that was kind of lighter, more gingery, it's definitely moved into the more kind of earthy, kind of cloves, star anise, a bit of aniseed as well, kind of definitely much more earthy, definitely much more kind of, I wouldn't say floral, I wouldn't say kind of, yeah, definitely more those earthy kind of dried spices, less of the fresh spice and more of that kind of, yeah, the dried cloves, that kind of spiciness does come through. I wouldn't say there's any cinnamon coming through, much more of the cloves, that the heavy kind of spiciness coming through. Still super sweet, still getting plenty of that kind of the butterscotch, the toffee, touch of vanilla coming through, but again, more on the caramel side of the sweetness. And I can tell on the finish, a little bit of that orange citrus is coming back, so I think I'm going to go in here for another sip, but we're going to focus on the finish. Cheers. Yeah, on the finish, as it goes, that kind of sticky toffee pudding, the caramel, the butterscotch, the toffee, those kind of start fading off, and then you get this kind of nice rising spiciness. You get a bit of oak influence coming through. You get a little bit of kind of that orange peel as well coming through again, but it's not heavy on the orange peel. It definitely has more of that kind of that oaky spice coming through, that single pot still peppery spice. Not getting a huge amount of peppery spice, like normally you do get a bit of peppery spice, maybe a little of like a tingly kind of white pepper on the tail as everything else fades off, but it wasn't a huge amount of peppery spice coming through here. Definitely more on that cloves, the star anise, that kind of spiciness. And as it all fades off, definitely kind of the oak and that spice is definitely what kind of lingers the longest on the whiskey. I think that for a 4-year-old whiskey, this is a very good entry, especially as it's one of the first entries Ballykeefe have made to the market. Like, this is cask number 20 from the distillery, and I think it's a very good whiskey at 4 years old, especially since it is a single cask. So there was no finishing on this whiskey, there was no blending, so there's no way to hide any kind of imperfections. They've just put out a very, very good whiskey, and it makes me excited to see what they produce in future. Now, as I said, this is only 4 years old, but they probably have casks that are now 5 years old, heading to 6, 7, 8 years old. So I am very excited to see what comes next. Now, I know they've already won some awards for their, like, I think their gins and their vodkas and their other spirits they produce in their lines. I can definitely see some awards in their future for their whiskey, especially as they've got a few different types of whiskey coming on stream. So I know that in 2018 they laid down a rye whiskey for a future release. I mean, it's 2023 now, so that whiskey is gonna be 5 years old soon. So I'm definitely excited to see what comes out next as their whiskey gets older, as they have more stock on hand. They maybe make some blends, they maybe get some interesting finishes on their whiskey. I think Ballykeefe has some very good things in their future, but even right now, they've got some very good things in the glass. So I'm going to keep on enjoying this. If you like the look of the review, maybe scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays, cocktail recipes on Fridays, and sometimes kind of fun videos on Mondays. So if you want to see more, make sure you hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Sláinte.